welcome back. I'm Tedward, and today, thanks to Bond Group in Waltham, Massachusetts, we have the pleasure of driving this gorgeous 1987 Porsche 911 Carrera. This is a 3.2-liter air-cooled flat six, and that's a familiar thing to say because I own one. I've got an 88 that was actually built the same month that I was born. This is an 87, basically the same car. The best thing about these late model Carreras is the transmission. They get the G50. The earlier cars got the 915 gearbox, which is an incredibly satisfying and crisp 5-speed manual. Not a dogleg, standard H pattern just like the G50, but the difference is that the G50 has stronger, more robust synchros, and as a driver, it just requires less finesse, and they last a bit longer. So anyone with a really crispy, nice 915 needs to be cautious because those that have been abused show it. There's a lot of crunchy third gears out there in those 915s, and I've driven some that I think, well, what's the big deal? These are the best, and I've driven others where I thought, wow, every gear change feels like I'm holding my breath, but not so much in the G50s. The G50 cars, this is where they really became great sort of daily drivers that could also do the track duty. But this is the thing about these 3.2 Carreras is that, man, oh man, did they rise from the ashes in terms of values. Back even 15 years ago, these were trading for not so much money. We're talking like 20 grand to 40 grand. 40 grand would buy you a really nice one. The thing is though, people started realizing that these were actually a real sweet spot in the 911 lineup. They weren't SCs. The earlier cars were a little slower. They didn't have the torque. They weren't quite as exciting. Once they slapped a Carrera badge back on this with the 3.2s, things got spicy, and these became really great drivers. They didn't have the style and look of a 993 though. Remember, this is still a time not so long ago where 964s were looked at as kind of meh, they're not the good looking ones, and 993s were looked at as the best looking 911 of all time. That's kind of flip-flopped. I mean, I still love a 993, but 964s have really had a glow up. So these 3.2 Carreras were owned by people who kind of beat the crap out of them. Not this one though. This Guards Red, beautiful example, has about 90,000 miles on it. My car has about 86 or 87,000 on it. But yes, they're used for fun, you know, maybe some autocrosses here and there, but this one wasn't like stripped out, destroyed. Everything functions really well. The interior looks incredible. And this is the thing, I'm really excited to drive this car today because my car is like an RS tribute car. This is basically stock as far as most of the, you know, interior and body is concerned. So it's always fun to have a comparison to be like, what was my car? What did it start as? And it's kind of like this. The doors close like tanks or bank vaults. And one of the best things about these cars is they've come back. If you look at 992s, they brought back the square edges that the 3.2 Carrera had. Even the mirrors are square. That was a rounded thing up until 991 ended. 992 has brought back this style of car. So the 80s are coming back in a big way in terms of the 911 heritage. Now, as far as form factor, to me, this is just perfect. It's old school, it drives old school, but it's got fuel injection. It's not that finicky. They drive, they start, they run. The only thing I think about this generation in America are these impact bumpers are just super clunky and awkward, but it's fine. You can always replace these. I've got roof bumpers, or roof bumpers, if you want to say it however you want to say it. I'll get corrected no matter what I do, so it doesn't really matter. Let's take a look at these Fuchs. The wheels are gorgeous. You've got the black on chrome, and one of my favorite things about these is this little guy right here on every corner to make sure that these valve stems don't snap off at high speeds. My car doesn't actually have these. Maybe I should get some. They've got a staggered wheel and tire size. You've got a 195 section tire up front on a 15-inch wheel and a 215 in the rear. Now, my car having the turbo brakes, which are quite a bit bigger, requires the 16-inch wheels to fit over them. So a lot of people do upgrade or change to certain things, but I still think that having that meaty sidewall on these 15s looks fantastic. It's wild how even though there's a narrower wheel and a smaller diameter, it doesn't take away from this car. It doesn't look less premium. And in Guards red with a black interior, chef's kiss. So let's take a look under the frunk, because one of the great things about these cars is all of the storage space. You know, you've got the Kinder seats in the back. You can fold those down so you can still put a bunch of stuff on like essentially a parcel shelf back there. I wouldn't recommend actually putting humans back there. I've done it. It's not comfortable. But up here, you've got plenty of room for stuff. You've got the beautiful carpet, and under here, you've got your small spare tire that you can blow up, a little space saver guy that does the job. You've got access to your brake fluid, so if you're doing some track duty, it's really simple to just, pop a wheel off, do your bleed, and you're good to go. And then around back, let's open this up. And while we're over here, we'll take a look down here, because this actually gives you the VIN number. And right here, you'll see 1086. So that's the manufacturer month and year right there. Mine says 488. So it's cool because you can always tell what's going on with these cars. It's very old school, very easy to see. Under here, we've got an air conditioner car, and you've got all the accoutrement that goes along with that. But, basically, you've got a big old flat six rear engine with a big fan on a belt. And that's what's doing everything. These are air-cooled cars. I can already hear, it's oil-cooled. It's oil-cooled. Yes, there's a lot of oil in these things. I think it's somewhere around 10 or 11 liters. Mine has a larger oil cooler up front, so I think mine takes a little bit more. But yes, oil does help cool these cars. Essentially what happens is as it's warming up and getting up the temperature, it's circulating from a tank into the engine. It pulls oil from that tank with throttle. And then as it gets hotter, there is a thermostat, and that thermostat will open, and then the oil will come up through the front of the car to an oil cooler and back. And that's what you got. Yes, oil is helping cool the car, but there are no water jackets on these cylinders, and there's just big jugs like you see on a Harley Davidson with the fins surrounding each cylinder. So air is the primary source of cooling, but yes, it needs to be lubricated. So sure, the oil cooler fanatics, you get to say that if you'd like, but it is an air-cooled engine. So let's jump in, start it up, and get this thing on the road. That's good stuff. All right, to start it up, got our key in our left-hand ignition, very 911 stuff, pretty common. And then we'll use our floor hinged pedals. We'll clutch in for our startup interlock. I think it has an interlock. I actually didn't test it. Maybe it doesn't. I'm sure I'll hear about it in the comments. In classic 911 form, we've got our 5 gauge pods with our tachometer front and center. Over here, you've got your fuel level. Big tank, 20 gallons in these things, or at least right at about 20 gallons. So you've got a crazy range on these cars. Your oil level, which is really interesting. So we can watch what happens to that oil tank as we get in the throttle. It'll come down a little bit because it's pulling oil out of the tank. That really only works when the car is warmed up. So we're pretty much warmed up right now. We've got a little bit of temperature in this oil, which is nice, but this is like a meaningless thing a lot of the time. It doesn't mean anything when you're driving. It only means something when you're warmed up at idle on flat ground. Pretty much end of list. If you're just driving down the highway and that looks low or whatever, like it actually doesn't mean much to you. This is your oil pressure, which is nice. Always good to see that. And a speedo with our odometer and a clock, which is lovely. This one still has all of the original stuff in it. So you've got the Blaupunkt sound system head unit and a nice little glove box and a little secret ashtray right here. Now, the climate control systems in these cars are bananas. Mine actually has the 2 little levers here. I don't know what years those are in. That's beyond my knowledge. And I still barely know how to use this stuff, even though I own one, but I've always managed to get the job done. So over here, power windows. We've even got a power sunroof right here, which is nice. And our door locks are manual, but they are electric, so when you lock the car from the outside, it will lock both sides. Anyway, handbrake down, let's get out for a drive. Takes a little bit of oomph, and you've got to get the car moving just a bit when you're steering, because there's no power steering in this 911. This is all manual, which is one of the best things about it. Super raw feel. You get the idea that in period, maybe people weren't that fond of that because it seemed outdated and old, and it kind of was. But now we look at this and we think like, man, how great is it that you can get an 80s car with manual steering, air-cooled power, and all this great stuff. That's the ticket. In stock form, this car is so much more of a just typical sports car than what I've got. My car is more of like a track rat vibe, where it's just really stiff. It's got spherical bushings and all kinds of crazy stuff that just make it a little harder to drive around town. This, while still incredibly composed, feels like I could be taking calls from the car, hands-free of course, and just using it normally. I could daily drive this and not feel that out of place, which is so cool to say about an air-cooled vehicle with no power steering. Now, if you're not a big Porsche guy, but you know a little bit, this is where people say, oh, I love your 964 or whatever. This is not a 964, it's pre-964, and it doesn't have like a chassis designation that's super easy, like 993, cute Aussie, or 991 or 997. This is just a 911. This is a G model, as they say, or G body. I think I always get corrected when I say G body, but I do. I guess G model is the more correct terminology for this. But that's what it is. So it is a car that you awkwardly have to explain sometimes to people who are more familiar with more modern Porsches. This light in the tachometer, it's a little arrow. It's just a little arrow. It's an upshift light. It's there to say, hey, you could probably use less fuel if you upshifted right now. And that's it. It's very simple. You see these in cars in that period all the time. It's not a wild thing, but I get that question all the time. I've had people even say to me like, oh my God, you're driving your car with low oil pressure because that light is on. Could be disconnected and it would mean nothing. I think one of the great things about these cars is that you always feel something when you're driving it. Everything's transmitted through the car, through the steering wheel. There's just enough vibrations, tactility, that it's always engaging at any speed. I never feel bored in these cars. Something that's better about, say, like an RS car later on, like a 964 RS. They shortened up the gear ratios a bit. They made them a little more racy. So something that I would, if I were building one of these cars kind of from scratch, or I wanted my 3.2 Carrera to be a little more intense, I would probably shorten up second and third gear for myself because they are far apart. And you almost get that like falling out of boost vibe between second and third unless you're wringing its neck to the end of the red line. This clutch is catching a little bit high. That's where you're finding me like kind of double pumping for the rev match. I'm not double clutching. I'm just like, ooh, you know what? I think I need some more revs before I come out of that. While we're sitting here waiting for traffic to go by, we should probably note the fact that the visibility out of these 911s is outrageously good. You've got huge rear quarter glass. I can see everything. I'm in a greenhouse. It's as good as you can get before you're basically in a convertible. Still plenty fast for today. It's nice to be able to get out in an older car and cruise at highway speeds, but it always feels older than it is. Sometimes you forget, like, oh, this is just an 80s car. Just encourages good behavior. It's a driver. It wants you to take a good line. It wants you to enjoy things. But, the long gearing, you're not going to be shifting constantly, which is honestly nice in the 915 because if you've got synchros that are blowing out, then maybe it's nice to just sit in third gear and not be trying to rip back and forth between second and third. In the G50, though, you almost wish those were really close gears so you could play with it more and more and more. The best thing about this car is the size of it on the road. It's pretty narrow, it's pretty small. It doesn't feel small inside though because its interior is just very open. So it's kind of cool to have what appears to be a tiny little car when you park it in a parking lot feel natural and comfortable for people of all sizes. This is great for a tall person. I'm 5'9", so I'm not particularly large, but I have so much headroom, definitely tons of room for a helmet. I have more room in this than I do in like a Huracan, so crazy comparison, but just goes to show you that it doesn't limit you by the size of the exterior. It's actually a really large vehicle. Go nice and slow over this bump. has such decent torque that, sure, I could be wringing out second to its last breath, but third is doing me just fine kind of in this mid-range. You don't need to be always just hammering on the thing, which probably goes to help its longevity. Although these are really reasonable long life cars. You see a lot of these for sale with like over 200,000 miles, well within the 100s though. And you know, this is still a baby at 9,500 miles. One thing that's tricky with these cars is heel toe downshifting. You've got to be really deep into the brakes before you can actually reach that throttle pedal. If you're not a 911 nerd, or if you're wondering like, well, they put the engine in the wrong spot, the benefits of a rear engine vehicle is mostly down to traction, your rear wheel drive. So you're putting all that weight over those rear wheels, which means that when you get on throttle, you're pushing really nice and hard on those rear wheels. That's how like you can get this thing to get off the line super hard if you're being violently aggressive with it. And it actually would even help it in the snow. It's kind of like putting, you know, sandbags in the bed of your pickup truck. The downside of that is you lose weight over the front of the car. So that means on a turn-in, you've got to give a little bit of trail braking in order to make sure that you're still giving some traction and weight over those front wheels. So, you know, we get into a corner, we want to transition into it with a little bit of brakes and then peel off as you kind of find it. Then you can get back on throttle and feed the throttle basically until the front of the car's giving up. You kind of just ride that understeer on the way out. So I'd highly recommend, if you're going to buy a G model or a 3.2 Carrera, hunt for a G50 transmission. I mean, that's known in the community. It's not, I'm not giving anybody some like novel, unique advice there. It's just the thing to do. But it does make a difference in drivability, and it'll make a difference in whether you want to be driving your car all the time. When you have a car that's frustrating to drive, and you can elect not to drive it, you won't drive it. It will sit in the garage. You're going to take the easier car. This is why people with lots of cars don't drive half their cars, because there's a few that are like, oh man, that's the one that always starts. That's the one that's not going to leave me stranded. That's the one that I don't have a persnickety gearbox. That's the one with the good brakes. That's the one with the steering that doesn't feel wonky. You know, so if you get like a really nice version of these G models, you get a fun, raw vehicle that feels older than it is, really. I mean, this drives like kind of a 1960s car, but with the reliability and robustness of the 80s and 90s. And I love having the two big headlight, you know, tubes or whatever you want to call it, the big body lines in front, because you see the corner of the car. That actually helps you when you're cornering and actually finding an apex, because I know where the right corner of that car is. unless I'm in an open wheel car, it's hard to see that. But with the 911, you always have that big headlight that you're like, man, I see it. I know where it's at. Even though this is the better gearbox, they're still not gearboxes that you want to rush. I don't slam gears like I'm drag racing in a 911. Kind of like a BMW. They don't like it. You let it accept the gear. It's just part of it. They still feel fantastic, solid, clunk into gear a little bit. They give you a really positive feedback that you know you're in there. But this is not a Camaro. And it kills me when I see people driving them in like complete anger, really ripping through them, because I'm like, oh, that's how they go bad. That's how they get crunchy. That's how they don't last for 200,000 miles. Coolest things about the car though is that it has a left side exit exhaust. So with these Jersey barriers or any walls that you're up against, you get such a great reflected sound off of the wall back into the car, back into the cabin. So on a nice day where you've got the windows down, you can blast around and really get the full experience of this engine. So I think we'll call it here for the 3.2 Carrera in pretty much stock form while this Ram flies around a corner and hopefully doesn't cream us. Jeez. Oh my goodness. I'm starting to get old. I'm like, slow down. Yeah. But, you know, time and a place, guys. I think these are pretty common. You know, I think a lot of people overlook these for a long time. They're seeing their heyday now. I think people are really appreciating what these cars are and were. And as cars get more technologically advanced and numb and lame and big, this is this shining star of a car that had really great power for a small size, good power to weight ratio, manual steering, a great gearbox in the G50, and they just serve the purpose of a 911 that you can drive for reasonable money. And reasonable money is changing these days, because a really nice one of these, well, it'll start to cost up to 6 figures now, which is insane because I did not pay anywhere near that for mine. But I would, you know, if you can't afford the $400,000 price tag of some of these crazy 964s, you know, an RS, I mean, that's not really quite in this league. That's a bit higher, but still, this is going to give you a car that you can actually afford to use and drive, take to a car show, still get proper Porsche Club of America treatment when you pull in, and you're just going to love it. These are just so much fun. These are like Toyotas in the sense that, like, you know, you buy your Land Cruiser and you keep it for 30 years. You just, if anything goes wrong, you just rebuild. Just keep it maintained and you should be good to go. So thank you guys so much for watching, liking, commenting, and subscribing. Don't forget to respect the drive. And I'll see you in the next one. And I am not going to go through this yield sign. This is still, I say this every time I drive here, this is the scariest yield sign in the world. There's like a jump right here. You can't see the cars unless you stop. I mean, goodness. Man, these seats are fantastic. I do have Recaro pole positions in my car with like 6-point harnesses. I mean, I love those seats. They're great, but man, oh man, I kind of wish I had another one. I don't want to like change my car. I just want a second one. I want this one. I would love to have this car in addition to my car. So that's like, okay, this is the one that you buzz around in and use. And then my car is the one that you take up on the Vermont back road getaways that you need to just go hammer it.